The Stanford Prison Experiment. In the summer of 1971, psychology professor Philip Zimbardo conducted what became one of the most infamous and controversial social experiments of the 20th century, the Stanford Prison Experiment. What began as a study of human behavior under conditions of authority and confinement spiraled into a disturbing display of cruelty and abuse, raising lasting questions about ethics and science. Funded by the U.S. Office of Naval Research, the experiment aimed to explore how people adapt to roles of power and subordination. Zimbardo and his team transformed the basement of Stanford University's psychology building into a mock prison. 24 male college students were randomly assigned roles as either guards or prisoners. What was expected to last 2 weeks ended after only 6 days. Almost immediately, the situation deteriorated. The guards, outfitted with uniforms, batons, and reflective sunglasses, began asserting dominance. They imposed harsh rules, subjected prisoners to humiliating punishments, and escalated into verbal and physical abuse. The prisoners, stripped of personal identity and reduced to numbers, quickly displayed signs of extreme stress, depression, and emotional breakdowns. Zimbardo himself, acting as the prison superintendent, became entangled in this scenario, failing to intervene as conditions worsened. It was only after a graduate student, Christina Masloch, confronted him about the psychological harm being inflicted that Zimbardo abruptly terminated the experiment. The scandal lay not only in the cruelty that emerged, but in the lack of ethical safeguards. Participants were not fully informed of the risks, and no meaningful oversight existed to protect them. The study demonstrated how quickly ordinary individuals could adopt oppressive behaviors when placed in systems of power, but at the cost of real psychological damage to its participants. The Stanford Prison Experiment remains one of psychology's most controversial studies. Some critics argue its methodology was deeply flawed and that the results were exaggerated. Others see it as a chilling lesson in the corrupting influence of authority. Either way, it helped transform ethical standards in research, ensuring future studies would require informed consent, monitoring, and protections for participants. The Milgram Obedience Study. In 1961, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted an experiment at Yale University that became one of the most disturbing yet influential studies in psychology. The Obedience to Authority Experiments, more commonly known as the Milgram Obedience Study. Its findings shocked the world by revealing just how far ordinary people would go in obeying authority, even when asked to harm another person. Milgram designed the study in the wake of the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi officials had defended their participation in atrocities by claiming they were just following orders. He wanted to test whether average citizens would commit acts against their conscience when instructed by an authority figure. Participants were recruited under the guise of a study on learning and memory. Each subject was told they would be the teacher, delivering electric shocks to a learner, an actor in on the experiment, whenever an incorrect answer was given. The learner was seated in another room, but his voice could be heard through the wall. The shocks were fake, but the participants didn't know this. With each mistake, the voltage supposedly increased, from mild jolts to dangerous levels marked with warnings like XXX. The learner would cry out in pain, beg to stop, and eventually fall silent, suggesting he had lost consciousness. All the while, the experimenter, a stern figure in a lab coat, calmly urged the participant to continue, using phrases like, "The experiment requires that you continue." The results were chilling. More than 60% of participants obeyed the experimenter's orders all the way to the maximum shock level, despite their visible distress and moral hesitation. They sweated, trembled, and protested, yet continued when authority demanded it. The study was condemned for its ethical violations. Participants left traumatized, believing they had harmed another human being. At the same time, it revealed something profoundly unsettling about human nature, that under pressure from authority, ordinary people are capable of extraordinary cruelty. The Milgram Obedience Study reshaped psychology, ethics, and even our understanding of history. It forced science to confront the dangers of unchecked obedience and reminded society that morality cannot be left solely to authorities' command. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study. Between 1932 and 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service carried out what is now remembered as one of the most unethical experiments in medical history, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. Unlike legitimate clinical research, this study became a chilling example of deception, exploitation, and institutionalized racism masquerading as science. The experiment involved 600 black men in Macon County, Alabama, about 400 already infected with syphilis and 200 without, serving as controls. The men, many of them poor sharecroppers, were promised free medical care, meals, and burial insurance. What they were not told was the truth. They had syphilis, and the government had no intention of treating them. At the time the study began, there was no reliable cure for syphilis. But after the 1940s, when penicillin became the standard treatment, researchers deliberately withheld it. Instead, they continued to observe the natural progression of the disease. Participants suffered blindness, organ failure, neurological damage, and early death, while doctors stood by, documenting the results. Wives were unknowingly infected, and children were born with congenital syphilis, extending the harm across generations. The scandal broke in 1972 when a whistleblower leaked information to the press. Public outrage was immediate, and the study was shut down. In the aftermath, survivors and families launched lawsuits, and the case became a catalyst for sweeping reforms in research ethics. Requirements such as informed consent, independent oversight boards, and transparency in human subject research were established in direct response to Tuskegee. The moral outrage lingers today. In 1997, President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology on behalf of the U.S. government, acknowledging the betrayal and pain caused. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study is not just remembered as a scientific scandal, but as a wound of racial injustice. A reminder of what happens when prejudice and negligence replace compassion and ethics in medicine. Unit 731, Human Experimentation. During the 1930s and 1940s, Imperial Japan conducted one of the most horrific programs of human experimentation in history. Known as Unit 731, this covert biological and chemical warfare research facility was based in Harbin, in Japanese-occupied Manchuria. Officially called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, its real mission was far darker: to test biological weapons and conduct gruesome medical experiments on live human beings. The victims were mostly Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, though Russians, Koreans, and even Allied soldiers were also subjected to these atrocities. Captives were dehumanized, referred to as maruta, meaning logs, to strip them of identity. The experiments defied imagination in their cruelty. Victims were exposed to plague, anthrax, cholera, and other pathogens to study their effects. Some were vivisected alive without anesthesia, so researchers could observe the progression of disease in real time. Others were subjected to frostbite tests, deliberately frozen and thawed to study gangrene. Still others were forced into chambers to endure dehydration, starvation, or lethal chemical exposure. The suffering was beyond comprehension, carried out in the name of science and military research. At its peak, Unit 731 employed thousands of personnel and is believed to have killed up to 250,000 people. The research was intended to develop biological weapons for the Japanese military, and evidence shows that plague-infested fleas bred in the facility were released in Chinese villages, causing outbreaks that killed tens of thousands. The scandal extends beyond the war itself. After Japan's surrender in 1945, U.S. authorities secretly granted immunity to Unit 731's leaders, including General Shiro Ishii, in exchange for their research data. Rather than facing trials like Nazi doctors at Nuremberg, many Unit 731 personnel went on to prominent careers in medicine, academia, and industry. Unit 731 remains one of history's darkest reminders of science corrupted by nationalism, militarism, and cruelty. It exemplifies the catastrophic consequences when human beings are treated not as subjects with rights, but as disposable objects for experimentation. The Monster Study. In 1939, at the height of the Great Depression, a group of orphans in Davenport, Iowa, became the unwitting participants in one of the most disturbing psychological experiments in U.S. history. Later nicknamed the Monster Study, this experiment was led by speech pathologist Wendell Johnson and his graduate student Mary Tudor at the University of Iowa. The goal was to investigate the origins of stuttering, but the methods left deep psychological scars. The study recruited 22 children from the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans Home. Half of them already showed signs of stuttering, while the other half had no speech difficulties. Tudor and her team divided them into groups and subjected them to drastically different forms of speech therapy. Some children received positive reinforcement, encouragement, patience, and praise for their speech. Others, however, were subjected to negative conditioning. They were harshly criticized for every mistake, told they were destined to stutter, and warned against speaking unless they could do so perfectly. The results were devastating. Children in the negative group, many of whom had spoken normally before, developed speech anxieties, lowered confidence, and in some cases, long-term difficulties with communication. While the researchers hoped to better understand stuttering, the cost was inflicting emotional harm on vulnerable children who had no way to consent or understand what was being done to them. The study remained largely hidden for decades, unpublished, and buried within university files. When it came to light in the early 2000s, outrage followed. Critics condemned it as unethical, cruel, and an abuse of orphaned children who were already disadvantaged. Survivors later came forward, describing the lingering shame and speech problems they attributed to their treatment during the study. The Monster Study now serves as a cautionary tale in psychology and medical ethics. Though its findings contributed little to the understanding of stuttering, its notoriety reshaped conversations about informed consent, protection of vulnerable populations, and the responsibilities researchers bear toward their subjects. Its legacy is not one of scientific progress, but of ethical failure, a reminder of how easily curiosity can cross into cruelty when compassion is absent. Operation Sea Spray. In September 1950, the residents of San Francisco unknowingly became test subjects in one of the most alarming covert experiments ever conducted by the U.S. military. Codenamed Operation Sea Spray, the test was part of a series of secret biological warfare simulations designed to measure the vulnerability of American cities to germ attacks. Without consent or warning, the government released bacteria into the air over a populated urban center, with deadly consequences. The Navy carried out the operation by using a ship anchored off the coast. From it, they sprayed massive quantities of two types of bacteria, Serratia marcescens and Bacillus globigii. At the time, these microbes were considered harmless simulants, chosen because they were easy to track due to their distinctive red and orange pigmentation. Over the course of a week, a dense cloud drifted across San Francisco, exposing nearly the entire city's population of 800,000 people. In the aftermath, residents were never informed. But in October 1950, a man named Edward Nevin died from a rare infection caused by Serratia marcescens, and several others in the same hospital developed similar infections. While the government denied responsibility, later investigations strongly linked the outbreak to the secret test. The scandal only came to light in the 1970s, when classified documents were declassified and congressional hearings revealed the extent of secret biowarfare trials on American soil. Public outrage followed, as citizens learned that San Francisco was not the only target. Other cities, subway systems, and military facilities had also been subjected to covert bacterial dispersal experiments. Operation Sea Spray is now remembered as a blatant violation of ethics and public trust. Citizens were used as guinea pigs without knowledge or consent, with real harm inflicted in the name of national defense research. It serves as a chilling reminder that even democratic governments, in times of paranoia and secrecy, can sacrifice the health of their own people for the sake of military advantage. The Aversion Project. In the 1970s and 1980s, South Africa's apartheid-era military secretly carried out a program that came to be known as the Aversion Project. It was not about defending the country from external threats, but about targeting its own soldiers who were suspected of being gay. Under the banner of curing homosexuality, military doctors subjected conscripts to brutal and unethical medical procedures that left many scarred for life. Young men were conscripted into the South African Defense Force and, if suspected of being gay, were often forcibly sent to military psychiatric hospitals. There, doctors carried out so-called treatments that included chemical castration, electric shock therapy, and experimental drug regimens. Some soldiers were subjected to sex change operations without their consent, performed not as legitimate gender-affirming care, but as punishment disguised as therapy. The program was run by Dr. Aubrey Levin, a psychiatrist who later fled South Africa and eventually faced charges of professional misconduct in Canada. His methods were steeped in the ideology of apartheid, combining racism, authoritarianism, and deep social conservatism with pseudoscientific claims about sexuality. For the victims, the consequences were devastating. Many were left physically mutilated, infertile, or with permanent psychological trauma. Families often never learned what happened to their sons, as the military cloaked the experiments in secrecy. Survivors reported feelings of shame and isolation that persisted for decades, compounded by the government's refusal to acknowledge the abuses at the time. The scandal came to wider attention only after the fall of apartheid, when testimonies before South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission revealed the scope of the program. While it shocked the world, many of the victims never received full justice or reparations. The Aversion Project is remembered today as one of the darkest examples of medicine being weaponized to enforce ideology. It serves as a warning of what happens when science abandons ethics and becomes an instrument of state oppression. The Vipeholm Experiments. Between 1945 and 1955, Sweden conducted what are now remembered as some of the most unethical medical studies in modern history. Known as the Vipeholm Experiments, they were carried out at the Vipeholm Hospital in Lund, an institution for people with intellectual disabilities. The aim was to study the relationship between sugar consumption and tooth decay, but the methods inflicted unnecessary suffering on some of society's most vulnerable people. Researchers deliberately altered the diets of hundreds of patients, feeding them large amounts of sugar, often in the form of specially manufactured sticky toffees designed to cling to teeth for as long as possible. Over time, doctors monitored the rapid spread of cavities, dental disease, and infections that developed as a direct result of the experiment. For many patients, this meant enduring years of pain, disfigurement, and neglect, all without meaningful consent or understanding of what was being done to them. The scientific results were clear. Sugar, especially sticky sweets, dramatically accelerates tooth decay. These findings influenced global dental health policy and helped shape recommendations that reduced sugar consumption worldwide. But the cost of that knowledge was borne entirely by patients who had no choice in the matter. Ethically, the Vipeholm experiments became a textbook example of what not to do in medical research. Vulnerable populations were exploited, consent was ignored, and harm was inflicted deliberately. When the details became public decades later, the experiments were widely condemned, and Sweden's medical community was forced to confront its dark past. The legacy of Vipeholm is a stark reminder. Science without ethics can achieve results, but at a price that diminishes its humanity. The suffering inflicted at Vipeholm ensured that future generations would push for stronger protections in research to prevent history from repeating itself. Thank you for watching. If you learned anything, let me know with a like, and comment below on what you would like to see in the future. History never runs out of surprises, and neither do we. So subscribe and join me for the next dive into the archives.